It was supposed to be just another quiet night at home, the kind where you sit on opposite ends of the couch scrolling through your phones, pretending everything's fine. But that night wasn't like the others. That night, I decided I couldn't pretend anymore. I'll never forget the way her face froze when I finally said it, when I told her I knew. "You went on a date behind my back," I said, my voice low but steady, even though inside I felt like my chest was caving in. She looked up from her phone, startled, as if she hadn't expected me to notice anything. Maybe she thought I was too blind, too trusting. Or maybe she just didn't care anymore. The evidence was right there in front of us. Text messages between her and some guy named Daniel, someone she worked with. Someone who clearly wasn't me. The texts weren't subtle either. They were intimate, flirty, full of promises whispered across late-night conversations. Promises she should have been making to me. First, she denied it, of course. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "This is insane. You're overreacting." But I wasn't overreacting. Not this time. I pulled out my phone and showed her the screenshots I'd taken earlier that day. Her expression shifted instantly, from anger to shock, then guilt. For a second, I thought she might cry. Instead, she doubled down. "It's not what it looks like," she insisted, shaking her head furiously. "You don't understand. I was lonely, okay? You're never here. Lonely." That word hit me like a punch to the gut. Was that really her excuse? Did she think throwing that word at me would make it okay? Before I could respond, she added, "And besides, Daniel, he gets me. He listens." That's when it hit me. This wasn't just a slip-up or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was betrayal, plain and simple. And worse still, she didn't seem sorry, not truly. As we stood there glaring at each other, the weight of her lies crushing the air between us, I realized something else. I couldn't stay silent anymore. As I stared at her across the room that night, I couldn't help but think about how far we'd fallen. It wasn't always like this, far from it. Once upon a time, she was my everything. My partner, my best friend. The woman who promised to stand by me no matter what life threw our way. I remember the day we met. It was at a work conference 5 years ago. She walked into the room wearing this bright red dress that made her impossible to ignore. When she smiled during her presentation, I swear the entire audience leaned forward just to hear her voice. Afterward, I introduced myself, nervous as hell, and somehow managed not to embarrass myself completely. We started talking, and before long we were inseparable. Coffee dates turned into dinners, dinners turned into weekends away, and eventually we moved in together. For a while, it felt like nothing could touch us. We dreamed big back then, about traveling the world, starting a family, building a future side by side. I still have photos of those early days tucked away somewhere. Pictures of us laughing on beaches, dancing under string lights at weddings, holding hands like teenagers too scared to let go. Looking at them now feels like staring at ghosts. But somewhere along the line, things changed. Life got busy. Work became all-consuming. For both of us. Our conversations dwindled to logistics. Bills, groceries, whose turn it was to take out the trash. Somewhere in the chaos, we stopped connecting. I wanted stability, security. A home filled with warmth and laughter. But looking back, I realized she wanted something else entirely. She craved excitement, passion, the kind of fire that burned so hot it left you breathless. And maybe I failed her there. Maybe I let routine smother the spark we once had. The signs were there if I'd bothered to look. The late nights at the office. The sudden interest in girls' nights with coworkers. The way she'd pull away whenever I tried to talk about anything deeper than surface-level small talk. At the time, I told myself it was stress or exhaustion, or any number of excuses people use to avoid facing the truth. Now, standing in that same living room where we'd shared countless quiet evenings, I realized I'd been fooling myself for months, or maybe even years. This woman, the one glaring at me now with defiance in her eyes, wasn't the same person I fell in love with, and maybe I wasn't the same man either. That night, after she threw her excuses at me like daggers, I knew I couldn't let it rest. Her words, "You don't understand. I was lonely. Daniel gets me," kept replaying in my head. gnawing at whatever shred of trust one had left. Lonely? Did she really think that justified what she'd done? Or was it just an easy way to twist the knife a little deeper? I needed proof. Not because I doubted what I'd seen on her phone. I already knew the truth. But because I wanted to see how far she'd gone. How much of our life together had been a lie. So, while she stormed off to bed, slamming doors and muttering under her breath, I stayed up. I sat at the kitchen table with her phone in my hand, scrolling through messages I never should have read, but couldn't stop myself from opening. What I found made my stomach churn. It wasn't just flirty texts or vague hints of attraction. It was a full-blown affair. There were plans for secret meetings, inside jokes only they understood, even declarations of love. Love. The word burned in my mind like acid. She'd said it to him, the man who wasn't me. But the worst part? The photos. Hidden deep in her gallery, buried among screenshots of work emails and random memes, were pictures of them together. Him in his tailored suit, her glowing in a dress I didn't recognize. They were sitting close at some upscale restaurant, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. Like we didn't exist. My hands trembled as I stared at the image, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just a casual fling. This was calculated, deliberate. And then it hit me, the date must have happened weeks ago. Weeks. While I was working late, thinking we were just going through a rough patch, she was out with him, building a life I wasn't part of. When I confronted her again the next morning, I didn't hold back. I showed her the photos, watched her face pale as she realized I knew everything. For a moment, she looked genuinely scared. Then came the excuses. He's different, she said, her voice trembling. He listens to me, unlike you. You're always so distant. Distant? Was that how she saw me now? Not as the man who loved her, supported her, built a life with her, but as someone cold and unreachable? And what about us? I shot back, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. Were we just a placeholder until something better came along? She didn't answer. Instead, she turned away, tears streaming down her face, but I wasn't buying it. Those tears weren't for me. They were for herself, for getting caught. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I realized this wasn't just about one betrayal. It was about years of neglect, lies, and broken promises. She hadn't just cheated on me. She'd dismantled everything we'd worked for without a second thought. As I stood there, staring at the woman I once loved, I made a silent vow. If she could destroy my life without hesitation, then I wouldn't hesitate either. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and obsessive thoughts. I couldn't eat, couldn't focus on work, couldn't escape the image of her sitting across from him at that restaurant. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them laughing together, sharing secrets meant for me. It was like a poison spreading through my veins, consuming every ounce of peace I'd ever known. At first, I considered forgiveness, or at least I told myself I did. Maybe it was guilt talking, or maybe it was the remnants of love I still clung to despite everything. For one fleeting moment, I thought about sitting down with her, hashing it out, trying to salvage what was left of our marriage. But then I remembered the look in her eyes during our last confrontation. Not remorse, not regret, but defiance. She didn't want to fix things. She wanted to justify herself, to shift the blame onto me as if I were the villain in her story. That's when the anger took over. Anger at her for betraying me. Anger at myself for letting it happen. And most of all, anger at the universe for allowing someone I trusted so completely to hurt me this deeply. I couldn't let her walk away unscathed. I wouldn't. So I began planning. At first, it was just vague ideas, ways to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she'd inflicted on me. But soon, those ideas crystallized into something more concrete. I started small, gathering information, bank statements, property deeds, investment portfolios. Anything tied to our shared life became fair game. I reached out to a few trusted allies, a lawyer friend who owed me a favor, an old colleague skilled in cybersecurity, and laid the groundwork for what would come next. Together, we devised a plan to dismantle her carefully constructed world piece by piece. Accounts would be drained, assets liquidated, properties sold. all under her nose while she remained oblivious. But revenge isn't just about taking, it's about leaving scars. I made sure to leave behind little reminders of my presence. Cryptic notes slipped into her purse, and signed letters mailed to her office. Subtle changes to our shared digital accounts designed to unsettle her. Each move was calculated, each detail deliberate. As the pieces fell into place, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. This wasn't just about hurting her anymore, it was about reclaiming control. For years, I'd let her dictate the terms of our relationship, bending over backward to keep her happy. Now I was calling the shots. By the time I packed my bags and walked out the door, I knew exactly what I was doing. She'd taken everything from me. My trust, my dignity, my future, and now I was going to take it all back. The execution of my plan was both exhilarating and terrifying. Every step I took felt like walking a tightrope, balanced precariously between triumph and disaster. But I didn't falter. Not once. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice, served cold and calculated. It started with the money. Our joint bank accounts were the first to go. Late at night, when she was asleep or distracted by her phone, I transferred funds into anonymous offshore accounts I'd set up weeks earlier. Thousands disappeared in seconds, leaving behind only cryptic transaction descriptions like, "for services rendered," or "final settlement." By the time she noticed, it was too late. The trail was untraceable, even for her fancy business connections. Next came the properties. We owned 2 homes together. The house we lived in and a vacation condo by the lake. Selling them outright would have raised suspicion, so I got creative. Through shell companies and intermediaries, I orchestrated private sales, funneling the profits directly into accounts she had no access to. The buyers never met me face to face. Everything was handled remotely, leaving no paper trail tying me to the transactions. Her prized possessions, the designer bags, the jewelry, the luxury car, were next on the list. Some items I sold discreetly online, using burner accounts to avoid detection. Others I donated anonymously to charities, taking quiet satisfaction in knowing they'd bring joy to people who truly needed them. Her beloved Mercedes? I listed it under a fake name and watched as strangers haggled over its price, unaware of the storm brewing in her life. But the real masterstroke was the psychological game I played. Alongside the financial sabotage, I planted seeds of paranoia. Notes began appearing in places only she could find them. Tucked inside her wallet, slipped beneath her pillow, left on her desk at work. Each one carried a simple message. "I know. You can't hide. This isn't over." They weren't signed, but she knew they were from me. I could see it in the way her hands trembled when she read them, in the panicked calls she made to friends asking if anyone had seen me. Then there were the digital breadcrumbs. Using skills borrowed from my cybersecurity ally, I hacked into her email and social media accounts, subtly altering details here and there. Appointments were canceled, passwords reset, contacts deleted. At first, she dismissed these glitches as technical errors. But as they piled up, her Instagram posts vanishing overnight, important emails going missing, she started unraveling. Paranoia turned to desperation, and desperation to chaos. Finally, the day arrived when I decided to vanish completely. I packed a single suitcase, wiped every trace of myself from our shared spaces, and walked out the door without looking back. No note, no explanation, just silence. For weeks, she tried to reach me, flooding my voicemail with tearful messages and pleading texts. Friends and family called too, demanding answers I refused to give. Eventually, they stopped calling altogether. In my absence, her world crumbled. Without access to funds or assets, she defaulted on loans and racked up debts. Her reputation suffered as rumors spread about her affair and subsequent downfall. Colleagues distanced themselves, embarrassed by association. Even Daniel, the man she'd chosen over me, distanced himself once he realized she had nothing left to offer. Not financially, not emotionally. Watching from afar, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. She'd built her life on lies, and now those lies were consuming her. Justice, though bitter, tasted sweet. Months passed, and the initial rush of vengeance began to fade. At first, I thought revenge would fill the void she'd left behind, that seeing her suffer would somehow make me whole again. But it didn't. Instead, I found myself staring into the mirror, wondering who I'd become. Was I any better than her? Had my quest for justice turned me into someone unrecognizable? I spent long nights alone in a small apartment I rented under an alias, replaying every moment of our marriage in my mind. The fights, the silences, the promises we broke without realizing it. For the first time, I allowed myself to see the cracks I'd ignored, the moments when I could have reached out but chose not to, the times I let work take precedence over us. Maybe I hadn't been the perfect husband I imagined myself to be. Maybe I'd failed her too. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't about excusing what she'd done. Nothing could justify her betrayal. But understanding my role in the unraveling of our relationship gave me clarity. I realized that holding on to anger was poisoning me just as much as it was hurting her. Revenge had given me power, but it hadn't brought peace. Slowly, I began rebuilding not just financially but emotionally. I threw myself into therapy, unpacking years of buried resentment and self-doubt. I reconnected with old friends I'd neglected during the chaos of my marriage, rediscovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. And most importantly, I started forgiving not her but myself. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or condoning. It was about letting go of the weight that was crushing me. Meanwhile, rumors trickled in about her life after I disappeared. She'd lost everything. Her job, her savings, even custody of our dog, Max, whom she adored more than anything. Friends whispered about how broken she seemed, how desperate she was to piece together what remained of her shattered existence. Part of me felt vindicated. She deserved to feel the pain she'd caused me. But another part felt pity, not because I wanted her to suffer less, but because I understood now that destruction doesn't heal wounds. It only creates new ones. One evening, as I sat on the balcony watching the sunset, I reflected on how far I'd come. I wasn't the same man who'd walked out of that house months ago. Back then, I'd been consumed by rage, blinded by the need to hurt her as deeply as she'd hurt me. Now I saw things differently. Revenge hadn't fixed me. It had merely been a stepping stone toward something greater, growth. I also thought about the cost of my actions. Destroying her life hadn't erased the scars she'd left on mine. The trust issues, the lingering fear of vulnerability. They were still there, reminders of what I'd endured. But instead of letting them define me, I decided to use them as fuel for change. I vowed never to settle for less than I deserved, never to ignore red flags again. If love came knocking at my door someday, I'd greet it with open eyes and a healed heart. Redemption isn't easy. It's messy, painful, and often incomplete. But standing there, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink, I felt lighter than I had in years. I wasn't free of the past, but I was no longer its prisoner. Years later, fate, or perhaps coincidence, brought us face to face again. It happened in a crowded cafe downtown, where I'd stopped for coffee on my way to meet a client. At first, I didn't recognize her. She looked older, thinner, her once vibrant energy replaced by a weariness that clung to her like a shadow. But when she glanced up from her table and our eyes met, there was no mistaking it. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, she stood and approached me. Her voice trembled as she spoke. I didn't think I'd ever see you again." I nodded, unsure of what to say. Up close, the toll of her choices was evident. The faint lines around her eyes, the nervous twitch of her hands clutching a worn leather bag. Gone was the confident woman who'd once laughed with another man across candlelit tables. In her place stood someone fragile, almost unrecognizable. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "For everything. For hurting you. For ruining us." Her apology caught me off guard. Not because it was unexpected, part of me had always hoped she'd regret what she'd done, but because it felt so raw, so genuine. Still, I hesitated. Apologies can't undo actions, and forgiveness isn't something easily given. "I don't know if I believe you," I said finally, my tone measured but firm. "You had your chance to fix things. Instead, You burned everything down, including yourself. She flinched at my words, but she didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. Inside were documents, letters addressed to creditors, proof of payments toward debts she'd accrued after I left. I've been trying to make amends, she explained. To everyone, to myself. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know I've changed. We stared at each other for a long moment, the weight of unsaid words hanging heavy between us. Finally, I took the envelope without comment and turned to leave. As I walked away, I heard her call out one last time. Please, take care of yourself. I didn't look back. Did I forgive her? Did she truly change? The truth is, I'll never know for sure. Some wounds heal over time, while others leave scars that linger forever. What I do know is this: revenge gave me power, but redemption gave me freedom. And sometimes that's enough.